video about a cartridge. CIP's website is an absolute abomination and should be exercised. But anyway, this is going to be about the cartridge called the 7x50R. Now, some of this is going to sound confusing and boring to a lot of you, so don't watch. This is a cartridge that was submitted to or okayed in 1992 in the European Union, and it's a cartridge that was originated in Germany. The cartridge information includes the following on the CIP page. By the way, this is the reason I use it. It's just digging through. It's a pain in the rump. The land diameter versus groove diameter of the barrel. This is based on a barrel being made with a 6.98 millimeter bore and then putting in rifling to 7.24 millimeter. This is a Ferroy bullet that's 7.25, so it does jam in and get stuck into the rifling. That's what it's supposed to do. Now there's a forcing cone, or something I'm going to call it, or a funnel into this rifling that starts out its life at 7.27 millimeters, which seems excessive, and it goes on for a distance of 6.5 millimeters, and then that's the starting point for where the bullet enters. That is probably to accommodate for the bullet not being perfectly centered and or not being perfectly in line or coaxial to the axis. Next, as the bullet is, again, 7.25 millimeters, and the tip of the bullet in the cartridge max length is at 68 millimeters. Now, of course, this is called the 7x50, so 50 has to show up here or something close to it. Let's continue. And now we go to the mouth of the casing. This is at the, just right where the bullet is inserted, is 6.82 millimeters. Now what that means is that if you take the diameter of the bullet at 6.25 and subtract it from that and then divide that by 0, that gives you the thickness of the metal in the cartridge case. The case mouth is at 49.5 millimeter. Now that may be where it decided to have the 50 millimeter. Rounding up to the nearest millimeter seems like what they were doing. Although at 49.5 millimeters, that's rather odd that they would leave it like that. I would, assume otherwise. But anyway, now that neck, or the mouth, goes down to the neck of the cartridge, which is only 0.01 millimeter larger diameter, but it has to be a little bit belled out. And that is the neck area where the sides of the bullet goes into, and that's where it has to be so that it has it oriented straight and also allows for a progressive crimping or tightening around it for gas tight seal. And that is at the 42.9 millimeter height for its neck. So from 42.9 to 49.5, that's the length of the mouth to neck ratio, or the length of the neck itself, or the crimp, or whatever you want to call it. It's got lots of names, and yes, in French, for some reason, it was also put as crimp. Now, the shoulder, yes, we're using biological mentionings, is at 9.4 millimeter, and that is at 41.97 millimeter height, tapering down to the neck. That's a very short distance. So this is a very abrupt cartridge that is probably using that for head spacing the entire cartridge, making it much more critical. It can't be just jam fit. It has to really fit correctly. It's a very short distance. It's, let me look here, it's a little bit less than 1 millimeter length over the whole thing. Now we go all the way down to the bottom, and it has belled out from 9.4 to 9.59 millimeters. And that's the base diameter at the 1.5 millimeter height above the absolute bottom, which is the rim. The rim is 10.9 millimeters in diameter and is 1.4 millimeter thick. Now that's me describing it, and this is also sometimes, I call it, a chamber equation, because I mentioned the bore diameter for the rifle barrel, the rifling depth that's done, the forcing cone, and then all of the other drill bit sizes you would use to build this up. Pro tip, if you're going to do anything like this sort of thing, you would start off making sure everything's centered by the smallest bore diameter, so before you even put rifling in it, you'd want to get all your lines drawn on the blank, which means the rim diameter might be drilled before you do some of the rest of the chamber, but definitely after the forcing cone. Just in case you're curious. Depends on the cartridge. Not a set rule. So now let's go on to the visual diagram. Now here's where we get a problem. The CIP German 1992 standards for the 7x50R. Another website brings up the same, almost identical information, so I have to mention the competing data. Standards are great, everybody's got one that's different from each other. Now these are so close to each other that they're probably talking about the same cartridge, and it could be a mix-up between the chamber dimensions and the cartridge dimensions. Both of them agree that the overall length is 68 millimeters, as is evidenced by the bullet tip here. Obviously, this part of the bullet would have very little, if any, effect on the chambering ability, since the barrel is supposed to match the sides of this bullet, which continue back into here, which is the reason we mentioned that. The dimensions are very important. So let's start at the base. Base diameter, again, was 10.9, but another page is listing it as 10.8, and it's a page called NABOJ, org, Naboji. So it's off by 1/10 of a millimeter, okay. And the height of it is supposed to be 1.4 millimeters, but the other website says it's 1.35. Now we get to the base diameter, and I'm presuming this is an accurate piece of information. It should be 9.59, but another page says it's 9.5. Again, this sounds like a lot like the chamber dimensions versus the cartridge dimensions, because the cartridge is supposed to be smaller. So maybe the CIP page, maybe I'm reading it wrong. Well, no, I double-checked it, and it does get this information correct. Anyway, they both agree it's 9.4 for the shoulder diameter, so it sounds like this may be a variant. The page mentioned variants, but then says you have to pay them money to read it, so I'm not going to do that. And again, 41.97 versus 42, so someone's just rounding up. 42.9 down here, and that's the height from the base up, by the way. And this distance here is approximately 6 millimeters. Here we go with 7.9 versus 7.83. And again, we have 7.9 versus 7.82. There is a taper to the cartridge, and it would have to be there, so I'm assuming. But then again, this could be the chamber dimensions being mentioned versus the bullet or cartridge dimensions. The height for this is supposed to be 49.55 according to one website, but the CIP says it's 49.5 millimeters for the total length of the cartridge itself. And again, even the bullet's being argued about being 7.2 millimeters versus 7.25. So, yeah. So anyway, this cartridge was abnormally hard to find for two reasons. CIP's website kept offering the information, and then when I'd look it up, it wouldn't have any of this data. It took 8 tries to get the website to give me the answer. And I hate that. Next thing, this other website, the one that's called, again, Naboji, has the information just slightly different, but enough of it's identical, including the name, that I'm assuming it's the same data. So this would mean you'd have to get a hold of a cartridge and check it. As for its origin story, none of the websites mention its parent cartridge or anything. And the Wikipedia page does not exist. And I can state for a fact that there isn't enough information here for me to make a Wikipedia page or correct either of the websites. I hope this has been useful to anybody who might watch it and might want to have this information. Again, this has been information about the German-made 1992 certified CIP recognized 7mm by 50mm rimmed cartridge that's named that because of the bullet diameter, approximation, and or class, and the length of the case. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.